Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive in the polite histories of Charleston. In 1845, travelers riding the road that cut through the Carolina swamps would whisper a single warning to one another before dusk: don't stop at the 6-Mile House. They couldn't explain why. They couldn't name a law that had been broken, but every man who ignored that advice ended up the same way: cold, pale, his body folded neatly in a bed as if he had drifted to sleep and never woken again. And always, always, there was the smell. That faint, sweet, almond-scented perfume of poison, a trace no doctor could erase, no priest could bless away. Tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments right now, because this story, this hidden chapter, was buried beneath centuries of charm and southern gentility. And yet, here you are hearing it, because you're not like the others. You've chosen to look behind the curtain. The official record will tell you that Lavinia Fisher was America's first female serial killer. But those words, they don't even begin to describe the labyrinth of manipulation, greed, and psychological mastery she wove in Charleston's golden age. She wasn't just a woman with poison. She was a performance, a force, the perfect mask of Southern hospitality, hiding a hunger that chewed through lives and fortunes alike. She turned every assumption about purity, virtue, and feminine innocence into a weapon, one so sharp that the men who sipped her tea never saw the blade until it was inside them. But I'll tell you the part the books leave out. The real danger wasn't just Lavinia's charm or her poisons, it was the system that protected her. Charleston's elite, men who built their empires on rice, cotton, and human bondage, looked at her and didn't see a murderer. They saw an asset, a beautiful hostess who could disarm travelers, an inn that conveniently absorbed strangers carrying money, contracts, and secrets. Do you understand? She didn't operate in spite of the system, she operated because of it. That is the real truth buried in this story. And think about this. In the mid-1800s, life insurance was the new frontier of wealth transfer. It was a science of risk, numbers written down to predict who would live and who would die. And when healthy men in their prime started dropping like flies at Lavinia's inn, all the official explanations fit neatly into Charleston's social order: heat exhaustion, swamp fever, God's will. Nobody wanted to admit what was really happening, because to admit it was to expose the cracks in their empire. This is how corruption survives, not in shadow, but in plain sight, hidden by the blind faith of those who refuse to see. And as you listen deeper, you'll realize this isn't just a tale of one beautiful killer in a silk dress. It's a blueprint for how power cloaks itself in virtue. It's a warning. So tonight, as you descend with me into the humid backroads of Charleston, don't listen with the ears of a tourist. Listen like a man training his instincts, sharpening his perception, stripping away illusions, because once you know the truth about Lavinia Fisher, you'll never again mistake beauty for innocence, hospitality for safety, or authority for protection. You've stepped into forbidden ground, and the descent has only just begun. Charleston, 1845. The city shimmered like a jewel on the Atlantic coast. Gas lamps lit the cobblestone streets, and grand homes draped in ivy and iron balconies whispered of wealth pulled from rice, indigo, and human lives bent in chains. But behind that polished facade was a truth no one wanted spoken aloud. Charleston was a city addicted to appearances. Respectability was everything. To be seen in church on Sunday, to wear silks imported from Europe, to host dinners where the wine flowed like water. These were not just luxuries, they were survival. And in that world of masks and roles, Lavinia Fisher was a masterpiece of performance. She was young, beautiful, graceful, too graceful for the backroads, too refined for the creaking walls of a roadside inn. She seemed misplaced, like a rose blooming in a swamp. And that is exactly why she was dangerous. Travelers who came upon the 6-Mile Wayfarer house rarely suspected anything. They'd been riding for hours, sometimes days, through forests thick with pine and swamp where the air itself felt heavy enough to crush the lungs. When they reached her inn, it appeared like salvation. White columns, verandas open to the breeze, the sound of music drifting from inside. And then she appeared. Lavinia. her copper hair catching the last glow of twilight, her green eyes wide with welcome. Men who had spent weeks negotiating cotton contracts, men hardened by river crossings and gun duels, men who carried pistols under their coats, suddenly forgot themselves. Because here was a woman who looked at them as though they mattered. She asked their names, remembered their children's ages, laughed at their stories, and pressed a porcelain cup of tea into their hands as though it were a sacrament. And that tea, sweet, floral, warm, was more than refreshment. It was a weapon, laced with extracts of oleander, a plant beautiful enough to decorate, a gardens but deadly enough to stop the heart. Just enough poison to weaken them, to slow their breathing, to soften their minds. A perfect performance repeated over and over with clockwork precision. But the story is not only about poison, it's about how the world around her allowed it to happen. Because when the bodies began to pile up, wealthy travelers, land surveyors, cotton men, no magistrate dared speak too loudly. Too many powerful families had eaten at her table. Too many officials owed favors to her husband, John, who moved quietly, handled the money, kept the accounts clean. To accuse Lavinia was to accuse the system itself, and in Charleston, that was unthinkable. So the whispers spread. Men die at the 6 Mile house. Don't drink her tea. Don't meet her eyes too long. Rumors danced like smoke through taverns, but never rose high enough to reach the newspapers or the courtrooms. The city needed her charm. They wanted her to be harmless. They wanted to believe that death was just God's work in the swamps. But not everyone believed. There was one man who noticed what others dismissed. Samuel Hartwell, an insurance investigator from Virginia. Sharp-eyed, methodical, and unwilling to accept coincidence. Where Charleston saw random tragedies, Hartwell saw a pattern, and patterns, when traced to their center, always revealed design. And so Hartwell's descent began. He did not know as he followed the trail of insurance claims and almond-scented corpses that he was stepping into a world of velvet traps and honeyed lies. He did not know that every clue was leading him not just to Lavinia, but to the rotting heart of Charleston's respectability itself. Because what he was about to uncover was not just a woman poisoning men for profit. It was a ritual of control, a mirror held up to the very society that had birthed her, a system where beauty disguised corruption, where power fed on trust, and where death walked politely in a silk dress. And once he entered the 6 Mile house, there would be no turning back. The carriage wheels groaned as Samuel Hartwell crossed the bridge over Goose Creek. The swamp mist curled upward like ghostly fingers, clinging to the air, veiling the path in a damp shroud. He had been warned about this road. Travelers muttered of robberies, disappearances, curses, but Hartwell was not a man of superstition. He was a man of evidence, a man who believed every shadow concealed a fact waiting to be revealed. And yet, when he saw the inn for the first time, even his disciplined mind faltered. The 6 Mile Wayfarer house stood tall and elegant against the darkening forest, its white columns glowing faintly in the last light of dusk. Music drifted faintly from within, the sound of a piano played with delicate precision. Warm candlelight spilled through wide windows, casting a golden invitation across the gravel path. To any weary traveler, it looked like salvation. To Hartwell, it looked like a stage. He stepped down from the carriage, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The inn smelled of magnolia and something else, sweet, faintly bitter, almost medicinal. He noticed the gardens, rows of roses, jasmine and oleander, their blossoms trembling in the night breeze. Oleander, his pulse quickened. And then she appeared. Lavinia Fisher, standing in the doorway as though she had been expecting him. Her copper hair caught the flickering glow of the lamps. Her eyes, green as deep water, locked onto his. She smiled, not wide, not forced, but the kind of smile that makes a man believe he is the only soul in the world worth noticing. "Welcome, traveler," she said softly, her voice laced with a music that carried the authority of Charleston's aristocracy. "You look weary from your journey. Please, come in. You'll find rest here." Hartwell studied her, every motion precise, every word rehearsed yet natural. He had interviewed actors in Boston, men and women who could weep on command, laugh at nothing. But this was beyond performance. This was instinct sharpened into an art. Inside, the inn was immaculate. Chandeliers glowed, crystal glasses sparkled on polished tables, and rugs from Persia muffled his footsteps. The other guests, 3 merchants, a surveyor and a tobacco broker, laughed and drank as if this were a private club, not a roadside stop in the wilderness. John Fisher moved quietly in the background, silent and efficient, a shadow in contrast to Lavinia's radiance. She guided Hartwell to a seat, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, and poured tea into fine china. Steam rose in the lamplight, carrying that same sweet, bitter scent he had noticed outside. "You must try this," she said, pressing the cup toward him. "A restorative. It will give you strength." The room fell into silence for a breath too long. The other men watched with something between amusement and expectation. Hartwell felt their eyes, hungry, curious. How many times had they seen this same moment unfold? How many times had a weary traveler lifted this same porcelain cup to his lips, never to rise again? Hartwell did not drink. Instead, he raised the cup to his face, inhaled faintly, and set it down untouched. He smiled politely. "Later," he said, his Harvard voice calm and assured. "First, I'd like to hear about this remarkable house of yours." A flicker passed across Lavinia's face, gone in an instant, smoothed by another flawless smile. But Hartwell had seen it, the momentary fracture in the mask. He knew then that he was close, closer than any investigator had ever been. But he also understood something else, something that made his heart pound in the stillness of that room. He was not the hunter here, he was the guest. And in Lavinia's world, guests were prey. The inn was alive with sound, laughter, music, the clink of glasses, but beneath it all was a rhythm Hartwell couldn't ignore. Every smile too eager, every laugh too sharp, every word dripping with a tension that didn't belong in a place of rest. The men around the table weren't free travelers sharing stories. They were moths circling a flame, each step pulling them closer to immolation. The merchant nearest him, a stout man with ink-stained fingers, leaned forward eagerly, recounting his latest venture. His voice trembled, though he spoke of profits. His hands shook slightly as he raised his cup, Lavinia's cup, and sipped with blind devotion. Across from him, a tobacco broker slouched against the chair, his face flushed, eyes heavy-lidded. Hartwell noted the sluggishness in his speech, the faint grey pallor under his skin. Poison, slow and methodical. The symptoms were all there, wrapped in the illusion of warmth and merriment. And yet, none of them questioned it. None dared. Because Lavinia was in control of the room. Her presence moved like a tide, pulling and releasing at will. She laughed softly at a joke, and suddenly all the men laughed louder. She leaned forward to refill a glass, and every gaze followed the curve of her arm. She touched a shoulder, and a man melted into silence, eyes glazed as if he had been granted a blessing. Hartwell saw it clearly. This wasn't hospitality, it was domination. The manipulation was not just chemical but psychological. She built a world where these men abandoned suspicion willingly, offering themselves up with gratitude. That was her true genius. The poison was only the final act. He asked questions, lightly, carefully, about the inn, about the guests, about her family. She answered with flawless poise. A tragic childhood, she said, a devotion to her husband, John, a deep love for Charleston and its travelers, every story polished, every phrase rehearsed. And yet, there were cracks. Hartwell noticed how she shifted whenever money was mentioned, how her eyes lingered on documents left carelessly on the table, contracts, deeds, promissory notes, longer than was natural. How John, silent in the background, seemed less a husband and more a servant to her will, his loyalty absolute, his gaze empty. The guests never saw these cracks. Their eyes glazed with tea and flattery, they were too far gone. One spoke of expanding his trade routes into Georgia, another boasted of a land purchase near Columbia. Each revealed details no cautious businessman should have admitted in mixed company, secrets spilled as easily as wine, offered freely under Lavinia's spell. Hartwell sipped water, not tea, and kept his expression neutral. But inside, his mind raced. This was no accident, no random sequence of tragedies. This was design, a machine of murder built with silk and charm, with poison and politeness, perfectly calibrated to strip men of wealth, health and dignity before they ever realized they'd been marked. At one point, Lavinia's eyes met his again, green, sharp, calculating. For an instant he wondered if she knew. Did she suspect his purpose? Could she see through his facade as easily as he pierced hers? The thought sent a chill across his skin. The night stretched on, the laughter echoing hollowly in the candle-lit chamber, and Hartwell realized the truth with a weight that pressed into his chest. These men weren't guests at all. They were sacrifices, and Lavinia was the priestess presiding over the ritual. And he, Samuel Hartwell, investigator, skeptic, man of logic, was now seated at her altar. The laughter faded as Hartwell excused himself for the night, but it didn't vanish. It clung to him, echoing up the staircase, cloying and artificial, like the last notes of a song that refuses to end. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with oil lamps that flickered against the wallpaper, casting restless shadows that seemed to shift as he walked past. Lavinia herself escorted him, a single candle in hand. The flame painted her face in soft light, accentuating the sharpness of her cheekbones, the smooth line of her jaw. She spoke warmly, asking about his family, his home in Virginia, his travels. Every question carried weight. Each detail she collected filed neatly away for a purpose he could almost sense, but not yet name. At his door she paused, turning to face him. "I hope you sleep well, Mr. Hartwell. You'll find no safer place on this road than here." The words slid from her lips like silk, but Hartwell heard the blade beneath them. No safer place. He bowed slightly, thanked her, and stepped inside. She lingered a moment longer before retreating, her footsteps fading down the corridor. The room was immaculate, too immaculate. The bed freshly turned, the sheets pressed, a vase of oleander flowers arranged neatly on the table beside the lamp. Their blossoms glowed faintly pink in the lamplight, their fragrance sweet, almost overwhelming. Hartwell frowned. Oleander. Again. He knew enough botany to recognize the danger. Even the brush of its petals could irritate the skin. Yet here it stood, in a vase by his bed, like an offering or a warning. He checked everything with methodical care. The wardrobe, empty. The windows, locked. The water pitcher, clean. Then he turned to the bed. Beneath the sheets, the mattress gave slightly under his weight, but something felt off. Too soft in the center, too hollow beneath the frame. He lifted the edge, examining the structure. A carpenter's work, solid, but recent, modified. His pulse quickened as he traced the wood with his fingers, finding faint grooves where boards had been replaced. A trap. The thought struck him with icy clarity. Rumors had long whispered of beds collapsing, of guests falling through into pits below. He ran his hand along the underside, searching for mechanisms, hinges, nothing obvious. But the possibility lingered, gnawing at the edges of his composure. He extinguished the lamp, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight spilling across the floorboards. The inn creaked with nocturnal life, timbers settling, the wind pressing against the shutters, footsteps muffled in the distance. He listened. He had trained himself for this, to hear patterns in sound, and what he heard now was deliberate. A step, pause, another step, then silence. Someone was outside his door. He sat perfectly still, his hand on the pistol hidden inside his travel case. The footsteps did not continue. Whoever it was remained, waiting, listening. After what felt like an eternity, they moved on. The floor groaned, the sound fading into the distance. Hartwell lay back on the bed, every muscle tense, his pistol at arm's reach. He did not drink the tea she had offered. He did not close his eyes for long. Sleep in a place like this was not safety. It was surrender. And yet, as the night dragged on, one thought returned to him again and again, chilling him deeper than the footsteps, deeper than the oleander's perfume. She had looked at him differently. not like the others, not as prey, as though she knew he was not here by chance, as though she was already deciding what kind of game they were about to play. By dawn, Hartwell understood the truth. He had not entered the 6-mile house to investigate Lavinia Fisher. He had entered it to be tested by her. Dawn broke in Charleston with deceptive gentleness. Golden light streamed through the shutters, warming the polished floorboards of Hartwell's room, chasing away the shadows of the night. For any ordinary traveler, it might have felt like renewal, proof that the horrors of darkness had been nothing but the mind's invention. But Hartwell was not ordinary. He woke with pistol in hand, eyes sharp, mind alert, and he noticed immediately the oleander vase had been moved, just slightly, inches from where it had stood the night before. He had not touched it. Someone else had entered while he slept, or pretended to sleep. He washed, dressed, and descended the stairs. The inn was alive again, but differently. Too quiet, too thin. The laughter of the night before had evaporated, replaced by the delicate clatter of dishes and Lavinia's voice floating like silk through the dining hall. She stood at the head of the table, radiant in daylight, her copper hair catching sun through tall windows. She smiled as though nothing could be more natural than to greet her guests with warmth. But Hartwell noticed the details others missed. The faint redness beneath her eyes that suggested she had not slept, the way her fingers tapped lightly against the back of a chair, measuring time. Breakfast was served. Biscuits, ham, preserves, steaming cups of that same floral tea. The men ate greedily, their laughter forced but rising again under her encouragement. Yet something gnawed at Hartwell's mind. The table was emptier. The night before, he had counted 6 guests besides himself. This morning, there were 4. "Where is Mr. Claiborne?" he asked lightly, referring to the tobacco inspector whose flushed face and trembling hands had betrayed the poison's work. Lavinia's smile did not falter. "He left before dawn," she said smoothly, buttering a piece of bread. "Pressing business in Charleston, I believe. He asked me to give his regards." The other guests nodded as though this were natural, unquestionable, but Hartwell felt the lie in her tone, the careful placement of the words. He glanced at the others, the merchant pale and distracted, the surveyor yawning heavily, the rice broker clutching his stomach with an absent grimace, all poisoned, all entranced, all blind. The tea was poured again. This time Lavinia herself carried it to Hartwell, her eyes locking with his as she set the porcelain cup before him. "You must try it today," she said softly, her voice laced with insistence. "It will restore you after your long journey." Hartwell felt the gaze of the room. Every man waited for his reaction. His refusal the night before had been noted, an anomaly in her ritual. To refuse again might expose him. To drink would mean submission, perhaps death. He lifted the cup, inhaled faintly, and let the steam fog his glasses. "Later," he murmured, setting it down once more. "My stomach is unsettled in the mornings." A shadow crossed her eyes. Not anger, calculation, adjustment, like a predator changing tactics when prey doesn't follow the expected path. And then she laughed lightly, as though it were nothing, moving on to refill another man's cup. But Hartwell knew. She was watching him now, closer than before, testing, measuring, waiting for a weakness to reveal itself. As breakfast ended, the guests scattered, some to the stables, some to their rooms, all moving sluggishly as though weighted by invisible chains. Hartwell lingered, listening, tracing each sound in the house, doors opening, steps creaking, a muffled cough followed by silence. And then he heard it, through the floorboards, a sound beneath the house, heavy dragging, wood scraping, and a thud. The air in his chest froze. Someone had not left before dawn, someone had been removed. And Hartwell realized with cold clarity that he wasn't investigating murders that might happen. He was living inside them. That afternoon, when the sun was at its highest and most of the guests lay dozing in their rooms, Hartwell made his move. He had learned long ago that predators often relaxed after feeding, their vigilance dimmed by the illusion of control. And Lavinia Fisher, for all her brilliance, was no exception. He slipped from his chamber, careful not to let the floorboards betray him. The inn's hallways smelled of roses and smoke, the fragrance too heavy as if meant to disguise something more rancid beneath. He descended the servants' stairwell at the back, the narrow passageway lined with cobwebs, the air colder with each step. At the base he found himself in the cellar. Rows of barrels stood in neat lines, casks of wine stacked against stone walls. It looked, at first glance, ordinary, but Hartwell's eyes caught the details, the uneven dust, the faint scuff marks on the floor where heavy objects had been dragged. The smell, too, not just damp earth and mold, something sharper, metallic. He crouched low, running his fingers along the packed dirt, following the trail of disturbed soil. It led him to a wall at the far end, new brickwork, brighter than the rest, laid clumsily as though in haste. He pressed his ear against it. Silence. Yet his instincts screamed. Then, faintly, from deeper within the house, a creak. Hartwell froze, not from above but beneath. The floorboards shifted somewhere close, and he realized the truth. The cellar was not the end. There were spaces below this space. Hidden chambers. He examined the foundation carefully, his hand brushing across iron bolts and unfamiliar carpentry. The structure of the house had been altered, modified. Beds that collapsed, floorboards that opened, passages that dropped down into the earth. And then, movement. A dragging sound again, this time unmistakable, directly beneath him, followed by a muffled groan. Human. Alive. Hartwell's breath caught. This was no longer theory, no longer rumor. He was standing above the very machinery of murder. He traced the sound to a trapdoor at the far corner, half concealed under a rug and a stack of empty crates. The wood was stained, darker at the edges, and the iron hinges bore fresh scratches. He placed his hand on the handle, but paused. Opening it now would expose him. Lavinia's eyes were everywhere. Instead, he studied it carefully, committing every detail to memory. The trapdoor led somewhere, likely to pits dug beneath the inn, places where men vanished, where wealth was stripped and bodies discarded. He could almost hear them now, the faint cries of those who had fallen, the silence of those who never rose again. A sudden sound broke his thoughts, the slam of a door upstairs, heavy footsteps descending the main stairwell. Hartwell moved quickly, silent as he had been trained, slipping back into the shadowed passage just as John Fisher entered the cellar. John carried a shovel. His clothes were dusted with dirt, his face expressionless. He crossed to the trapdoor, heaved it open with the ease of long practice, and disappeared below. Hartwell's pulse thundered in his ears. He had come seeking truth, and now he had found it. The 6-mile Wayfarer house was not an inn. It was a slaughterhouse, and Samuel Hartwell was still inside it.